They say every Gilded Age mansion has at least one door that never truly opens. At Beechwood, the Astors' famed summer stage, that door doesn't creak or slam or draw attention. It just waits. No plaque, no portrait above the frame, only an unremarkable entry near the heart of the house, and a single stubborn fact. On paper, it exists as a private cabinet, contents not described. In a family that itemized every chair leg and silver spoon, this omission is not an accident. It is a decision, and it has been locked in place since 1884. The story begins far from Beechwood's marble halls, under the flat light of a modern reading room. An archivist, someone used to dust, catalog numbers, and the faint chemical smell of old paper, opens a bound, fading volume, an early inventory of the Astor estate at Beechwood. Page after page lists objects in neat Victorian script. Drawing room, 1 Aubusson carpet, 1 rosewood piano, 12 Louis XV chairs. The language is dry, almost bored, as if documenting wealth had become as routine as breathing, and then abruptly, the tone changes. On the right-hand page, wedged between gentleman's smoking room and library east wing, appears a new entry. No embellishment, no flourish, just 3 lines. Private cabinet floor area, 14x18, contents not described, access restricted. The archivist stops. Every other room has more words than space. This one has space without words. No mention of paintings, safes, or ledgers. No hint of what justified an entire, dedicated room. In an age obsessed with classification, here is something deliberately left unclassified. Beechwood was not an anonymous property. It was one of the nerve centers of Astor influence, a Newport cottage that was in truth a social engine. Under gas-lit chandeliers, guest lists shaped marriages, business alliances, and political careers. Newspapers described the balls, the gowns, the floral arrangements in syrupy detail, because that was the visible theater. But houses like Beechwood were built with a second layer of architecture, the quiet rooms where decisions really happened. Have you ever heard of a Gilded Age mansion that lists every piece of silver, but hides an entire room behind 3 careful words? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or forgotten heir, share it below. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. In the inventory, the private cabinet appears only twice. The first time is in that early catalog, where it is noted and then politely ignored, as if the mere act of naming it is already too much. The second reference, decades later, comes in a revised inventory compiled after renovations around the turn of the 20th century. The structure of the house changes. Walls moved, rooms enlarged, servant corridors adjusted to suit a new rhythm of entertaining. Yet the same rectangular space persists in the plans, again labeled private cabinet. This time with a terse note scribbled in the margin, sealed since 1884, no alterations. That year, 1884, belongs squarely to the high noon of the Gilded Age. The Astors were not just hosting parties, they were organizing power. It was an era of railroad monopolies, political machines, and backroom agreements that never saw the light of the press. For some families, the backroom was a literal place. In certain estates, the cabinet was where senators were received in private, where draft contracts were shown, where donations turned into influence and favors were promised in a language polite society pretended not to understand. When researchers compare the Beechwood inventory to others from Astor properties, patterns begin to emerge. Elsewhere, similar spaces are registered as private office, study, or occasionally cabinet, but nearly always with at least a passing list of contents. 1 roll-top desk, 1 safe, correspondence cabinet, file boxes, 2 leather armchairs. At Beechwood, the script refuses that level of detail. It is a room defined not by what it holds, but by who is barred from knowledge of it. And then there is the second line, buried deeper in the documentation. In a later insurance-related inventory, the private cabinet entry is followed by an almost throwaway clause. Private documents removed. No clarification. Removed by whom? When? To where? The phrase functions like a closed door inside another closed door. It confirms that something once lay inside the room, and that those somethings were not furniture or drapes, but papers, records, evidence. In a family obsessed with records, the absences start to speak louder than the surviving ink. It is one thing to discover an enigmatic phrase in an inventory. It is another to walk the corridors of Beechwood and realize that the space still exists, untouched. Years after the Astors left, after the property passed through different hands and incarnations, the blueprint stubbornly matched the physical reality. Behind the paneled walls and renovated rooms, one door remained curiously unchanged. No handle replaced, no plaques added, no attempt to repurpose the space for something as ordinary as storage or staff. The first documented attempt to match the inventory entry to the actual house came in the late 20th century, when architectural historians tried to reconcile original floor plans with the current layout. They expected minor differences. Old houses shift, grow, and shrink over time. What they did not expect was to find, in a quiet corridor off the main axis, a door whose proportions matched that 14x18 footprint almost exactly, and whose lock mechanism, by all appearances, had not been turned in nearly a century. The wood around the keyhole bore none of the scratches that come from regular use. Paint layers lined up perfectly, unbroken by the usual hairline cracks that appear where doors are routinely pushed open. On the inside of the frame, there was a faint, darker band where a seal might once have been affixed, and removed with care. The official maintenance records for the house, as preserved in later ownership files, mention repairs to nearly every part of Beechwood's aging structure. Roof tiles, fireplaces, plumbing, even repainting of old servant staircases. They never mention this door. It is as if maintenance staff were instructed to work around it, to let it age invisibly. Why would a family that prided itself on order and documentation choose to leave one room suspended in time? Why list every object in every other chamber, but allow this private cabinet to drift through inventories as an almost abstract concept? 4 walls, a floor area, and a note about private documents removed. Some answers have been proposed, mostly by those who prefer benign explanations. Perhaps it was a simple oversight, a clerical decision, a matter of privacy for correspondence that, while sensitive, was not sinister. People who believe this often remind us that the Astors were also human, with affairs of the heart and family disputes they had every right to conceal. But others, reading between the lines of surviving correspondences and press clippings, see a darker pattern. They note that the locking of the cabinet in 1884 coincides with a period of particularly aggressive political maneuvering among New York's elite, when the boundary between philanthropy and influence peddling blurred almost completely. They point to hints in letters about summer consultations at Beechwood, about meetings that could not be received in town, and about certain guests entering by side doors, away from the eyes of journalists and the curious. Have you ever stood in front of a locked door and felt, more than thought, that it was designed to keep out history itself? Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what families like the Astors tried so carefully to bury. As the modern researcher steps into the dim corridor and confronts the Beechwood door, the past and present converge. On the inventory page, the private cabinet is a gentle flourish of ink. In reality, it is a solid piece of wood and metal, cold to the touch, indifferent to questions. The lock is original. The hinges show rust where no hand has polished them in generations. Somewhere behind it, if the dimensions are right, there is a room that hasn't received a visitor since the year it was sealed. On paper, the cabinet is a mere annotation. In the house, it is a physical pause in the architecture, a space the Astors built, used, and then tried to erase with silence. And as the light of the corridor stretches across the threshold and dies at the line where the door meets the floor, one detail stands out. On the official floor plan, the room is there. On the public descriptions of Beechwood, it isn't mentioned at all. It is just a rectangle with a name on a forgotten page and a keyhole that has been waiting for more than a century. The keyhole at Beechwood is not just a piece of metal. In the architecture of the Gilded Age, it is a punctuation mark, the small, deliberate pause in a sentence written in marble and gilt. To understand why the Astors would create a room that exists in ink, but not in description, you have to step back from that narrow corridor and see the entire house as they did, not as a home, but as a device. Beechwood was called a summer cottage in the language of polite society, but nothing about it was modest. It was an instrument of social engineering. In Newport, Beechwood presented an almost theatrical facade to the Atlantic light, sweeping lawns that ended in clipped hedges, verandas that wrapped around the house like a promenade in a private club, drawing rooms flooded with tall windows and imported fabrics. From the carriage circular to the main staircase, every inch of the place was designed to direct movement and attention. When the summer season began, invitations to Beechwood were not about fresh air and sea breezes. They were summonses to a stage where reputations were made and unmade. On the surface, the choreography looked simple. Guests arrived, hats and canes were taken by uniformed staff, names were announced with a practiced cadence. Inside the Great Hall, a carefully curated crowd mingled under chandeliers heavy with crystal. There were balls, charity events, musicales, all the visible rituals of high society. But among the guests were men who controlled railroads, banks, shipping lines, politicians whose campaigns depended on those fortunes, diplomats temporarily freed from official protocol by the excuse of private hospitality. In the Gilded Age, such houses were more than private retreats. They were unofficial annexes of power. The decisions that shaped tariffs, franchises, and mergers did not always originate in public offices. They often arrived in those offices already refined and agreed upon, polished in rooms where no clerk took minutes and no reporter was allowed to linger. A senator might defend a bill in Washington that had effectively been drafted, in spirit if not in ink, in a Newport cottage over a glass of brandy at midnight. The architecture reflected that double life. Public rooms formed a clear axis. Entrance hall, main salon, ballroom, terrace. These were the spaces that appeared in society columns and visitors' memoirs, the golden halls where photographers, when allowed, captured gowns and jewels. Beyond them, smaller rooms branched off along less obvious corridors. Smoking rooms, morning rooms, studies, libraries. Each doorway had a social filter attached to it. The farther from the main hall you walked, the tighter the circle of access became. Within that hierarchy of space, the idea of a private cabinet makes sense. The term did not spring from nothing. It echoed European royal and ministerial traditions, where a cabinet was both a room and a circle of confidants. In the American Gilded Age, men who barely trusted the government they influenced often recreated that model in their own houses. A cabinet might look at first glance like a simple study, a desk, a safe, shelves of books. But its real function was more intricate. It was a hybrid zone where personal fortune and public policy could meet without leaving fingerprints. Unlike the library, which might be shown off to guests as proof of cultivation, the cabinet was not part of the tour. Unlike the drawing room, it did not exist to impress. It existed to contain. Only those whose presence was necessary were invited inside. Transactions that were technically legal but morally questionable, promises that would sound like corruption if spoken under oath. These belonged to the cabinet. In the public rooms, men raised glasses to the prosperity of the nation. In the cabinet, they calculated how much of that prosperity could be captured, redirected, or delayed. For the Astors, whose name had become shorthand for both wealth and social gatekeeping, the management of space was everything. Caroline, the Astor as she was known, used Beechwood as a filtering device. To be invited there was to be acknowledged. To be received more than once was a kind of tacit admission into a closed circle. Behind the glitter of the ballroom and the glare of gaslight, the house sorted people. Those who remained in the brilliant, noisy outer ring, and those who, by degrees, were drawn inward toward the quieter, more consequential rooms. Imagine a typical evening in the peak of the summer season. The orchestra is playing, gowns rustle like distant surf, and the air is threaded with perfume and cigar smoke. A visiting politician laughs loudly in the ballroom, visible to all. Hours later, his absence from the dance floor goes politely unnoticed because it would be indelicate to comment. Somewhere deeper in the house, away from music and mirrors, a door closes with a soft, deliberate click. Inside, in a room without witnesses, a conversation begins about campaign funds, railroad rights-of-way, or the timing of a federal investigation. No stenographer records a word. In houses like this, every threshold has a purpose. Servant corridors allow staff to glide unseen, moving food and messages like a hidden circulatory system. Secondary staircases offer discreet routes for favored guests. Some doors are meant to impress, others to conceal the movement behind them. And then there is the door that leads to the private cabinet, the one that appears in the plan but not in the tour, the one whose lock seems to have frozen in 1884. In a place where each portal played a part in the choreography of power, that door was different. It was engineered not merely to be closed, but to avoid being mentioned at all. In a house calibrated so precisely, would you have the courage to cross the one threshold designed to leave no trace in any official record? That is the quiet question that hangs over Beechwood's corridor like dust. Golden Age secrets live not only in the grand halls and ballrooms, but in these narrow spaces where forbidden rooms hold the decisions that never made it into any archive. This is why the inventories matter. In lesser houses, records might be vague, inconsistent, or lost altogether. The Astors, however, treated documentation as an extension of their control. Inventories listed furniture, art, silverware, even the number of servants' beds and the type of carpets underfoot. Insurance. Schedules broke down valuables by room, assigning monetary values to paintings and porcelain. Estate papers tracked transfers of ownership with the cold precision of ledgers. On paper, the Astor world was supposed to be knowable, itemized, safely bounded by columns of ink. And yet, when you lay the Beechwood inventory beside those from other properties, the private cabinet stands out like a missing word in an otherwise fluent sentence. The drawing room has its descriptions. The dining room has its crystal, its sideboards, its exact count of chairs. Even the cloakrooms and service areas are dutifully noted. 1 long bench, 5 coat hooks, 2 umbrella stands. Then comes the cabinet. Floor area, name, access restricted, contents not described. A room reduced to the fact of its existence and the insistence that its interior is not for the record. Later documents deepen the strangeness. In the sequence of inventories that follow renovations, rooms change shape and names. A small morning room is absorbed into a larger salon. A dressing room becomes part of a suite. Notations in the margins indicate walls moved, chimneys sealed, doors added. Yet the cabinet's footprint remains untouched, like a dark tile in a shifting mosaic. Worse, at a certain point, its line in the list begins to shrink. The phrase "contents not described" disappears, replaced simply by "private cabinet, sealed." The reference to private documents removed appears only once, and even that seems almost accidental, as though a clerk briefly forgot the rule of silence that governed this particular space. For an archivist tracing the patterns of elite behavior in the Gilded Age, this is where the house stops being just architecture and becomes testimony. The cabinet is not just a convenient room where papers were kept. It is a chamber intentionally spared from the usual administrative gaze. Other rooms shelter objects. This one shelters omissions. It is an absence framed in wood and stone. Inside Beechwood, the hierarchy of access is carved into the very routes servants are allowed to walk and the paths guests are encouraged to follow. On paper, the hierarchy is encoded in how rooms are named and how fully they are described. Public rooms are lavish in both senses, richly decorated and richly detailed in the records. Private family rooms are more modest but still enumerated. Only the cabinet is protected by vagueness. It is a forbidden room, not because a sign says so, but because the ledgers themselves avert their gaze. The closer you look at those ledgers, the more deliberate that aversion appears. In one surviving copy, someone, no one knows who, has run a faint pencil line beneath the entry for private cabinet, as if to draw attention to it, or perhaps to mark it for later review. The ink above is confident and steady. The graphite mark is lighter, tentative, almost nervous. There are no follow-up notes in the margin, no corrections. Just that thin underline. Like the quiet emphasis of a reader who understood that in a world of itemized wealth, the most revealing thing on the page might be the one room that refused to be described. And on the opposite page, where other rooms have columns of values beside them, the space next to private cabinet is blank, an empty column where numbers should be. A rectangle of paper mirroring the silent rectangle on the floor plan. Both waiting, both insisting that something is there and will not, for now, be named. The 1884 inventory of Beechwood does not look like the beginning of a mystery. It looks like work. Heavy paper, ruled in faded blue lines, the headings laid out with bureaucratic care. Room, dimensions, contents, estimated value, notes. At the top of one page, in a practiced, almost impatient hand, someone has written, ground floor, revised after alterations, June 1884. It was supposed to be a simple update, the kind that happens whenever a Gilded Age family decides their summer cottage needs to reflect their growing importance. The list starts predictably enough. Great Hall is first, its square footage noted, followed by a parade of objects that sound like stage directions for wealth. One grand staircase, carved oak, 2 marble consoles, 1 mirror, gilt frame, 4 gasoliers, 1 Persian carpet, worn at center. The pen moves briskly through the drawing room, the music room, the library, each space given a kind of prose poem in miniature, all chairs and tables and imported. Fabrics pinned to the page with numbers. Drawing room, east, the clerk writes. Wallpaper, silk damask, 3 sofas, 12 chairs, Louis XV style, 1 pianoforte, rosewood, 2 cabinets, vitrines, assorted ornaments, see separate list. The rhythm is steady, confident. It is the voice of a system that believes it can capture an entire world by naming it. Then the eye drops a few lines and the cadence breaks. Between library and gentleman's smoking room, there is a shorter entry, set slightly closer to the margin, as if it were trying not to take up too much space. Private cabinet, 14x18, access restricted, contents not described. No furniture, no objects, no estimated value in the usual sense. The pen that had been so generous with detail suddenly closes its grip. For historians of the Golden Age, this 1884 inventory is the first time the Beechwood private cabinet steps out of rumor and into the record. Before this, the room is only implied by the architecture and by later mentions. Here, in the middle of a renovation campaign, someone had to decide what the house officially contained. Walls had been moved, fireplaces realigned, smaller rooms reabsorbed into larger suites. A meticulous family needed updated paperwork to match their updated palace. In that context, the appearance of the cabinet is logical. The house has changed, the plan must be corrected. From a legal and insurance standpoint, a room cannot simply vanish. It takes up space. It affects the value of the building. It must be acknowledged. And so, perhaps reluctantly, the clerk writes it down. Private cabinet. Name, size, a closed door. Contemporary inventories from other Gilded Age estates confirm this pattern. Rooms used for discreet negotiations, spaces where Golden Age secrets were traded, where hidden heirs were discussed and forbidden agreements outlined, often appear only as thin lines of ink. They are recorded minimally, just enough to satisfy insurers and architects. A label, a dimension, nothing more. Everyone involved understands that describing the contents would defeat the purpose of the room. Yet even by that standard, the Beechwood entry is extreme. Most private offices at least receive a nod to a desk, a safe, a bookshelf. Here, the contents column is a long, horizontal absence. In its place, under Notes, the clerk writes a phrase whose blandness hides its weight. Keys kept by Mr. Astor only. On the next line, in tighter script, almost squeezed between the ruled lines, another note appears: no staff access without written permission. The language is dry, but the implications are not. In a house where footmen and maids circulated everywhere from the ballroom to the family bedrooms, the idea of a room categorically closed to staff is unusual. Servants knew things. They were the silent witnesses of the Gilded Age, moving through forbidden rooms, overhearing half-conversations. To keep them out entirely, the Astors had to build not just a lock, but a rule. The accounting oddity is subtle but telling. In the estimated value column, most rooms are assigned amounts that reflect their furnishings. The dining room, with its silver and glass, gleams in numbers. The music room's piano and instruments inflate its figure. When the clerk reaches the cabinet, there is no itemized sum. Instead, a small mark appears, a diagonal stroke like a shorthand tick, followed by the words, "Included in general policy, structural." The room is acknowledged as part of the insurable fabric of the house, but what it holds is treated as something else, something that does not belong in an ordinary monetary column. It is an elegant way of saying, the walls are insured. What passed between them is not for this ledger. The margins of the page add their own whispers. Near the cabinet entry, a later hand, maybe an administrator, maybe a cautious accountant, has added a faint pencil note. Documents transferred. See separate file. The phrase echoes the private documents removed we encountered in later inventories, but in 1884 it sits as a provisional remark, not yet absorbed into the official text. No reference number follows, no indication of where the separate file might be. It is a gesture toward another record that may or may not still exist. If you followed this far, you can feel how the ink itself seems to resist the room. The clerk records the drawing room with ease. The cabinet requires a different posture, a different vocabulary. This is not a place to be captured in object lists. It is a mechanism within a mechanism, a chamber designed to host conversations that would never survive the light of formal minutes. In the broader culture of the time, such practices were understood without being openly discussed. Political clubs in New York had side rooms where deals were struck before a vote. Bank directors met informally in private apartments before walking into boardrooms. The line between public and private was not a moral boundary, but a question of where paper would be allowed to exist. Beechwood's cabinet, as it appears in 1884, is part of that unwritten system. The same page that names it also reveals where it sits within the house. The inventory is organized not only by room name, but by circulation. The Great Hall leads to the drawing room and the music room. The library is marked as connecting to a west corridor, which then branches to gentleman's smoking room and private cabinet. A simple arrow, sketched in ink, links the cabinet back to the library with the note, "Internal door only." There is no mention of any connection to the more public spaces. This tiny arrow is a map of privilege. To reach the cabinet, you do not walk there from the ballroom with everyone watching. You peel away from the main current of the evening, perhaps with a pretext. A book to be consulted, a letter to be found in the library. From there, away from the musicians and chatter, a smaller door opens to the corridor that serves only a few rooms. The cabinet waits at the end, near enough to the smoking room to share its air of masculine privacy, but separated enough to be more than an extension of it. The inventory reflects that hierarchy. Library West is described with books, a large table, 2 reading chairs, a globe. Smoking room lists upholstered chairs, a card table, cigar boxes, a humidor. Then the cabinet. No objects, only rules. It is a room defined not by what it contains, but by who may approach its threshold. In a house where every door has a function in the choreography of power, the 1884 document shows the cabinet as a kind of architectural whisper, It has no reason to exist unless something needed to be kept away from the ordinary circuits of conversation and service. The proximity to the library hints at the form that something might have taken: papers, maps, contracts, letters, things that could be folded, sealed, burned. Looking at the inventory now through the eyes of a modern researcher, the omissions are as revealing as the ink. The clerk could have written desk and safe and file cabinet and still told the truth. That they chose instead contents not described tells us there was an understanding. Naming even the furniture would be a step toward acknowledging the function, and the function was precisely what everyone had agreed would never be set down. In a system built on ledgers and lists, this is how erased records look, not as gaps in the paper, but as carefully managed absences, covered over with neutral phrases. The dark legacy of the Gilded Age is preserved not in what was written, but in how some things were deliberately not written. From this dry 1884 page, the story bends back toward the house itself. You can trace the sequence of rooms with your finger, and then walk those same steps in Beechwood's surviving corridors. Great hall, drawing room, library. The light changes with each transition, from blazing chandeliers to softer lamps, until you reach the place where the public gaze no longer follows. The internal door only that existed first as an inked arrow becomes a narrow passage in wood and plaster. At the corridor's end, the inventory's thin line resolves into substance. The door with the old lock, the faint scar where a seal might have been, the silent space behind it that has not been opened since the year this inventory was written. On the page, the cabinet is a nameless box in a column. In the house, it is a volume of air and dust that still holds, in some intangible way, the last breath of conversations no one was meant to overhear. The 1884 ledger tries to treat it like any other room, give it a name, a size, a place in the structure, but the very effort only makes its difference clearer. Surrounded by rooms full of crystal, carpets, and listed treasures, the cabinet is a rectangle of silence surrounded by ink, and in the lower margin, where the diagonal accounting tick hovers beside that silence, the paper seems to hesitate, as if even the numbers understood there were some doors you could not price, some thresholds you could only mark and then leave to the shadows. On paper, the private cabinet is just a line between other lines. Inside Beechwood, it is a decision carved into wood and stone. To see what it meant, you have to pull back from the keyhole and reconstruct the house around it. The geography of privilege that made secrecy. Not an accident, but a design choice. Beechwood's ground floor, at the height of the Gilded Age, followed a pattern common among the great Newport cottages. From the sea-facing lawn, carriages rolled up to a broad circular drive. Guests entered through a great hall that rose 2 stories, the kind of space meant to make people feel smaller than the house and, by extension, smaller than the family who owned it. The main axis ran straight from that hall toward the drawing room and the ballroom. Beyond, a clear, bright path lined with mirrors, portraits, and carefully placed flowers. This was the world the newspapers described. The sweep of the staircase, the clink of glass, the glimmer of jewelry. Flanking this public spine were more controlled chambers, the music room to one side, the formal dining room to the other, each with large windows facing the grounds, as if to advertise their existence to any visitor who approached. Light was part of the message. The Astors had nothing to hide in these rooms. They wanted every chandelier to be understood as part of their public theater. Behind that glittering front, the house folded into more complex shapes. Service corridors hugged the back of the main rooms, allowing staff to move like a hidden current. Pantry to dining room, kitchen to butler's pantry, servants' hall to the base of the back staircase. Narrow doors blended into the paneling, letting footmen appear and vanish without disturbing the illusion of effortless hospitality. From the outside, Beechwood looked monolithic. From within, it was a maze of social gradients. Somewhere between those 2 layers, the bright facade and the invisible machinery, the private cabinet found its place. The 1884 inventory hints at its coordinates. The library anchors the west side of the main floor, slightly removed from the harshest light, with tall, shaded windows and built-in bookcases. Attached to it by an internal doorway is a short corridor that does not appear in any Surviving Society Descriptions. That passage runs parallel to the outer wall, connecting the library to the gentleman's smoking room and, finally, to the cabinet at its end. The cabinet itself, if you trace the dimensions, does not present a window to the front facade. Instead, it occupies an interior corner of the plan, sharing walls with other rooms but showing almost nothing to the outside world. The only light, plausibly, would come from a high, narrow window facing a side court or a borrowed glow through transoms over interior doors. It is a room meant to be approached, not admired. This positioning was no accident. In the Gilded Age, the placement of private political spaces followed a logic as strict as any etiquette manual. Rooms for confidential meetings needed three things: proximity to social areas, to make comings and goings appear natural; distance from servant routes, to limit involuntary witnesses; and at least one discreet line of retreat, for guests who could not afford to be seen leaving at the wrong moment. At Beechwood, those conditions were met with unnerving precision. The internal door from the library meant that a man could peel away from a gathering with an excuse as harmless as, "I must check a reference," or "I have a letter upstairs." A secondary staircase, accessible from the same side of the house, connected this cluster of rooms to a less conspicuous entrance on the ground level, something closer to a service door, yet refined enough for a certain kind of visitor. A banker, a political fixer, a lawyer bearing sensitive drafts could arrive without his carriage pulling up to the main steps, in full view of the assembled. The servants' circulation, by contrast, was guided elsewhere. The back stairs rose nearer the kitchen, serving the family bedrooms and main guest suites. Hallways that led to the cabinet were interrupted by doors that, while not hidden, were plainly meant for private use. A housemaid could dust the library, but the narrow corridor beyond was another matter. The notes in the inventory, "No staff access without written permission," suggest that even those trusted enough to move among the family's papers were expected to stop at a particular threshold. It is possible that the cabinet's door, when new, was not dramatically disguised. Gilded Age secrecy often preferred the mundane. A paneled door identical to half a dozen others, distinguished only by the sturdier hardware of its lock, could blend into the wall, with no need for tricks. In certain lights, it might even read as a continuation of the wainscoting, the handle lost in shadows. The point was not to create a theatrical hidden chamber. It was to make the room seem boring to anyone who did not already know why it mattered. There are hints, however, that some refinement went into that camouflage. In later photographs of Beechwood's interior, long after the Astors had gone, paneling near the west corridor shows irregularities. One section with slightly newer paint, a patch of wood where the grain runs at a different angle. It would not be unreasonable to imagine that, at some stage, a flush panel concealed the door more fully, only the keyhole betraying its function. Whether that paneling dates back to the 1880s or to a later owner's attempt to neutralize a troublesome space, the effect is the same. A door that does not immediately announce itself as a passage. Inside, the cabinet's geometry would have been tight and deliberate. 14 by 18 feet is large enough for a substantial desk, 2 or 3 chairs, perhaps a small table, shelves or cabinets along the walls. It is not large enough for a crowd. This is not a conference room. It is a chamber for small, sharp conversations. 2 men at a time, 3 at most, seated close enough that their voices never need to rise. In such a room, sound would be part of the design. Thick walls mute whatever washes in from the library. If there were a window, heavy drapes could be drawn, not just against sunlight but against the piercing clarity of seaward air. The door's reinforced core, if it had one, would do the rest. A servant passing in the corridor might hear nothing but a murmur, indistinguishable from the house's background hum. The important sentences, the ones that could ruin reputations or fortify them for a generation, would stay between the people inside and the papers on the table. The cabinet's location also speaks to hierarchy. It is neither on the ground floor, where the comings and goings of deliveries, messengers, and lesser guests would generate too much noise, nor tucked up in a tower or attic, where visiting a room would require an obvious absence. Instead, it sits at the intersection of public enough to be plausible and private enough to be deniable. A senator invited to discuss a bill or a railroad tycoon weighing a merger could step into the library, disappear for half an hour, and return to the flow of the evening as if nothing unusual had taken place. This is how Golden Age secrets embedded themselves in architecture. The elite did not simply own secluded properties, they engineered routes of movement through them. A visitor's entire sense of a house could be controlled by which doors were opened, which staircases suggested, which vistas offered. Beechwood's cabinet is the logical endpoint of that philosophy. A room whose very existence depended on most people never needing to know it was there. The sense of, intocability, the idea that certain families existed slightly above the reach of the law, the press, even of time, was built not only from money and influence, but from these controlled geographies. When you can decide who stands in which room, what they see and what they never notice, you can decide what history will remember. The official story of Beechwood is a path through ballrooms and terraces. The unofficial story runs through a narrow side corridor, into a plain door with a lock almost no one is allowed to touch. For the modern researcher moving through the house long after its social season has ended, these patterns still press against the air. The main hall echoes with the memory of orchestras and the scrape of chairs. The library is quieter, filled with the faint smell of old bindings and dust. Beyond it, the corridor to the cabinet feels different. Narrower, cooler, as if the house itself were changing tone. There are no velvet ropes here, no interpretive plaques. Later, owners have used nearby rooms for storage, for offices, even for mechanical equipment. But the door at the end of the passage remains curiously untouched, its hardware older than the hinges on either side. Stand there long enough, and the geometry of the place becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, the path back to light and open space. On the other, a thickness of wall that ends in a volume you cannot see. It is in that blind spot that the Astors placed their most controlled room. A cabinet, with no public description, no friendly nickname, no place in tour brochures. A room anchored to the library, insulated from servants, buffered from the eyes of casual guests, and quietly connected to a side entrance that allowed certain visitors to appear and vanish with minimal witness. In a house like this, you do not stumble onto that door by chance. You are brought to it, or you seek it, or you are kept away from it by layers of architecture and etiquette that prevent the question from ever forming in your mind. Most people in every era of Beechwood's life simply walked past the junction where the corridor began, following the light and the sound elsewhere. But documents have their own geography, and once the inventories whispered the cabinet's name, someone inevitably followed the ink. A century after the clerk wrote "access restricted" in his neat 1884 hand, the phrase would turn into a challenge. The same measurements that once guided builders and insurers would guide a different kind of visitor, one looking not for comfort or favor, but for answers. The route was the same: hall, drawing room, library, the discreet turn into the narrow passage. But the house received this traveler differently. No orchestra masked their steps. No polite conversation blurred their intentions. Only the sound of their own shoes on the floor and the faint creak of a building long past its season. They stopped, finally, at the door whose position made so much sense on paper. A door without a plaque, framed by paneling that pretended it belonged to the wall more than to any room. A door whose lock for decades had been the quiet center of Beechwood's geography of silence. And as a new key turned, metal protesting after 100 years of stillness, the house seemed to hold its breath in that narrow corridor, as if even now it understood that some spaces were built to keep certain stories from ever stepping back into the light. The door did not give way at once. It shuddered under the pressure of a key newly cut to match a lock whose tumblers had not moved in generations. Metal scraped, wood flexed, and then a small, reluctant click. The sound was not loud, but in the narrow corridor it felt dissonant, as if the house itself had grown unaccustomed to the idea of letting this room breathe again. When the hinges finally turned, their slow complaint settled into a silence thick enough to seem intentional. The first breath of air from inside was stale, almost weightless. The faint odor of paper and dust that has spent too long trying to remember what year it is. A thin veil of particles drifted through the light from the corridor, turning it opaque. No one had crossed this threshold for decades, possibly a century. The interior absorbed the intrusion with the stillness of a sealed archive. Inside, the cabinet was smaller than imagination had made it, yet every inch of space felt deliberate. Shelves lined the walls, their once rich varnish dulled to a matte hush. A desk, its curved edges out of fashion long before the family left the house, sat slightly askew, as if the last person to rise from it had not expected to be the last. A pair of chairs gathered dust in the corners, shy of the light. Nearly everything bore the softened outline of a sheet once thrown over it, now collapsed in thin, brittle folds. But it was the shelves that drew the eye. On them sat a collection of boxes, wooden, cardboard, even a few metal tins, that looked less like an archive than the remnants of one. None bore labels. None carried dates. Their arrangement was too uniform to be random, yet too cautious to be systematic. The boxes had not been packed for storage. They had been curated for disappearance. The first box opened gently, as if it feared its own contents. Inside, loose papers lay in untidy strata, half-letters, unsigned notes, pages where the top corner had been torn away so precisely it could not have been an accident. Many had small patches of roughened paper where wax seals once clung. Someone had removed them carefully enough to leave the text intact, but forcefully enough to deny any hint of sender or recipient. You could read the words, but not the motives. The letters were written in the cultivated hand typical of the 1880s, straight, confident strokes that belonged to men accustomed to dictation and clerks. They were not love letters. They spoke of tariffs, of proposed consolidations between railway companies, of municipal franchises that would allow certain lines to expand into New York or Boston. One note mentioned a discussion postponed until summer, Beechwood preferable. Another, unsigned, referred to sentiment in Albany and the need to keep Messrs. H and L divided until after the session. The names were never fully written. Initials stood in their place, a code as old as politics. In a second box, small bundles of pages were tied with string whose fibers had begun to fray. These pages seemed more personal, fragments of meeting summaries perhaps, or aides memoir. Some carried lists of dates and single-line reminders. Monday, R to confirm figures. Thursday, W wants assurances. Late July, Speaker to Newport. Others were more cryptic, only half-sentences or annotations scrawled on the backs of envelopes. The effect was not of reading a complete file, but of encountering the edges of something intentionally dissolved. It is the removed seals and missing covers that tell the clearest story. In the Gilded Age, the destruction of identifying features was a common method for sanitizing political correspondence. If the information had long-term value, numbers, terms, proposals, it was preserved. If the origin could incriminate, it was erased. Removing a seal accomplished both tasks. The paper remained, but its allegiance vanished. Whoever sat at this desk understood that distinction intimately. Deeper in the cabinet, dust thickened into a low fog on the floorboards. The shelves, once polished, now held faint fingerprints of time. Some of the boxes contained folders without covers, their spines torn away. A few scraps suggested they were once bound reports, perhaps drafts of legislation or minutes of unrecorded meetings, but the identifying pages had been excised. Only the interior notes remained, dense with underlines and abbreviations, the shorthand of men who could fill gaps from memory. One particularly fragile packet held slips of paper so thin they seemed meant for quick disposal. On them were phrases: coal rate adjustment, Boston line, assurances on committee vote, Summer Arrangement Banking Charter. None provided context. They had been stripped of names but retained enough structure to betray their purpose. This was not casual note-taking. It was the residue of negotiations carried out off the record and kept off it intentionally. And always, the gaps spoke louder than the ink. Places where a page ended abruptly, without signature. Marks where a fold had been cut away. Empty envelopes stacked neatly, as though awaiting contents that someone had decided could not survive the years. Even the handwriting changed from page to page. Different hands, different pressures, some refined, others hurrying through the script. Whatever discussions took place here were not owned by one man. They passed through several minds and several pens, none of which left a trace of identity behind. Have you ever found yourself in a room where every document seems to exist to record and erase its own origin in the same gesture? Faced with such papers, half evidence, half deliberate silence, would you speak, or would you step back into the shadows? Not everything inside the cabinet was paper. On the desk, beneath a sheet that had collapsed under its own dust, lay a small tray with pens, a dried inkwell, and a blotter worn into a faintly recognizable pattern. Pressed into that blotter were ghost impressions of words, the residue of letters never meant for any archive. The impressions were too faint to read directly, but they suggested urgency, overscrawls, corrections, a handwriting quickly. A single drawer in the desk resisted at first, then slid open with a soft groan. Inside lay 2 rubber stamps, their handles cracked with age. One read, "Received," the other simply, "Filed." Neither stamp had an accompanying date mechanism. They were tools for private order, not for administrative transparency. Paper passed through this room, was acknowledged, but not absorbed into any official chain. In another corner sat a small wooden file drawer, its compartments labeled only with letters C, F, R, T, W. Inside each, a handful of slips. The letters might have indicated subjects: coal, finance, railroads, tariffs, waterworks, or they might have stood for names. Every slip carried a brief notation: confirm, delay, reconsider, refuse, urgent. Not a full instruction, just a direction, the kind that would shape a conversation. Already underway. The absence of full names, dates, and identifying marks was not sloppy record-keeping, it was strategy. Whoever curated these papers understood that disappearance is most effective when it looks like incompleteness rather than erasure. A missing letter calls attention to itself. A fragment seems accidental. But when the same pattern repeats, seal removed, cover missing, initials instead of names, the accident becomes its own kind of ledger. Even the arrangement of the boxes seemed to follow an invisible logic. The upper shelves held the older, more brittle documents. The middle shelves contained papers from later cycles of negotiation, showing shifts in tone, from expansive railroad ambitions to more defensive strategies surrounding municipal regulation. The lowest shelves were nearly empty, as if someone had begun to clear them. Perhaps the last custodian of the cabinet had intended to finish the purge but never returned. In the far corner of the room, beneath another fallen sheet, stood a narrow cabinet within the cabinet, a tall, thin chest with a door secured by a simple latch rather than a lock. Inside were envelopes stamped with dates ranging across several summers. All were empty. Some still had adhesive residue where labels had been torn away. They formed a skeletal timeline, a chronology without content. A final box, heavier than the rest, rested on the floor near the desk. Inside, tied with a ribbon faded to a ghost of its original color, were what appeared to be draft speeches. The sentences were rhetorical, sweeping, clearly meant for public delivery. Yet entire paragraphs had been crossed out with thick strokes of ink. Those removed sections dealt with policies that had stalled or reversed. Tariffs rejected, mergers blocked, appointments derailed. It was as if these drafts were rehearsals for futures that never came to pass. Futures negotiated in rooms like this one. The more one looked, the clearer the pattern became. The cabinet was not simply a repository. It was a selective memory. It held the pieces deemed safe enough to survive, but stripped of the markers that would have given them context. It was the administrative shadow of a political engine, the last echo of a room designed to manage influence without leaving a trace. Standing in the dust and half-light, the modern researcher understood that the cabinet had not failed to preserve history. It had preserved exactly what it was meant to: evidence of action, severed from accountability. A room full of gestures toward decisions, but never the decisions themselves. The door remained open now, the corridor behind it brighter than the dim interior. But stepping back felt oddly difficult, as if the threshold were still doing its work, still asking whether the person who crossed into this room was prepared to know the kinds of discussions these papers implied, and whether, having known, they would ever speak of them clearly. In the end, the documents, what remained of them, offered only the beginning of answers. The rest lay in the gaps, the erasures, the torn edges. To understand what decisions had been shaped here, someone would have to reconstruct the patterns behind the fragments, follow the traces through other archives, other correspondences, other records the Astors could not control. The cabinet had offered its first revelations, but its silences were larger still, widening into the long shadow of decisions whispered in summers long past. The documents recovered from the cabinet did not confess. They suggested. Their language moved like water around a stone, reshaping truth through the discipline of euphemism. Nothing inside that room ever stated outright what it meant. Instead, it relied on a dialect of discretion, a vocabulary polished by decades of men who knew how to make an agreement sound like an accident and a political bargain sound like a shared principle. Spread across the desk, the papers revealed a pattern of phrases that recur so consistently they might as well have been part of a handbook. One letter fragment read, "Our understanding remains contingent upon developments in committee. Should sentiment shift unfavorably, support may need to be reconsidered." Another, unsigned, noted, "There is every expectation of mutual assistance should the matter progress as anticipated." Nowhere did these writers use words like deal, exchange, or condition. Instead, they leaned on abstractions, understanding, sentiment, assistance, each soft enough to pass for courtesy, each sharp enough to signal intent. The Gilded Age cultivated this linguistic opacity. In an era when fortunes were built on railroads, steel, and the shifting terrain of banking regulations, the men who navigated those landscapes had no incentive to reveal the mechanics of their influence. When the cabinet's letters discussed tariffs, they do so in coded brevity. Rates must remain favorable to Eastern interests, or adjustments to WAM. Proposed schedules would ensure stability. Such sentences, stripped of specifics, cloak economic leverage in the guise of national concern. In another bundle of papers, scraps of meeting notes used the abbreviated style of someone capturing only the essentials. W. Unsettled re-franchise. R. Promises vote if figures steady. Committee leaning against unless concessions offered. The initials evoke a network of actors without exposing them. The verbs, promises unsettled, leaning, imply motion, but avoid attribution. This is the language of men who understood that influence, to be effective, must be spoken of as lightly as possible. The letters concerned with railroad mergers were especially careful. One document, likely drafted for internal circulation among a group of financiers, stated, "Preliminary alignment appears feasible. Formal arrangement must await greater clarity on legislative disposition." There is no mention of lobbying, no hint of the private conversations that would shape that disposition. Instead, the text treats political outcomes as atmospheric conditions, things to be anticipated, not arranged. Even more delicate were the lines involving banking matters. One note, written on unusually fine paper, read, "Renewed discussion advisable prior to any public announcement. Sensitivities in certain quarters remain high." In Gilded Age parlance, sensitivities often meant opposition that could not be publicly confronted. Discussion meant negotiation behind closed doors. A second slip in different handwriting added, "Treasury sentiment unclear. Awaits signals via intermediary." No intermediary is named. The sentence leaves open the possibility, likely intentional, that the person reading it would know the reference without needing the convenience of ink. These fragments reflect a political ecosystem where legislation was not shaped solely in Congress or state houses. Decisions took their first breaths in private rooms like this, where drafts of bills were rewritten to benefit corporations friendly to their authors, where nominees for regulatory posts were vetted by businessmen whose industries they were meant to oversee. In the letters, such maneuvering is couched in phrases like anticipate favorable outcome or confidence in selection process, signals to insiders that their preferred candidate or policy was now on a predictable path. Urgency threads through many of the notes. One fragment, dated only July, warned, timing critical. Announcement must precede vote or leverage diminishes. Another stated, delay dangerous, press already stirring. Here the euphemisms give way slightly, hinting at the tension beneath the polite veneer. These documents were written in real time, under pressure, shaped by legislative calendars and newspaper deadlines. The men behind them orchestrated influence the way others conducted business, through deadlines, pressure points, and the careful management of perception. For the modern eye, one of the most telling features of this correspondence is its avoidance of personal pronouns. The writers often used the passive voice, it has been suggested, it is believed, it will be understood, as though the decisions emerged from the ether, untouched by individual agency. This stylistic choice served two purposes. It insulated the writer from direct responsibility and conveyed the illusion that political momentum was something natural, not engineered. Occasionally, the mask slipped. In a torn letter someone had written, "See reluctant unless reassured opposition. Must be approached discreetly." The line suggests a boundary between public allegiance and private doubt. Whoever C was, his vote had currency, and reassurance was a commodity. The letter fails to mention who would provide that reassurance, but its placement among the cabinet's papers implies the answer. The documents also hint at coordination between press allies and political actors. A thin sheet, barely legible, carried the sentence, editorial favorable but requires reinforcement. Ensure placement by midweek. Such instructions blur the line between public opinion and its manufacture. In Gilded Age politics, newspapers often mirrored the interests of their financial patrons, and these papers suggest how intentional that reflection could be. Even the tone of the scraps reveals hierarchy. Letters written in a confident declamatory style likely came from powerful figures comfortable setting terms. Others are tentative, probing, suggesting subordinates or intermediaries trying to interpret instructions without overstepping. The cabinet was a meeting ground for these disparate voices, a space where influence compressed into shorthand. Read together, the documents form a linguistic portrait of Gilded Age power. Cautious, indirect, allergic to explicitness, yet unmistakable in its intent. They reveal negotiations about import tariffs designed to protect specific industries, about railroad concessions that would determine which families controlled which lines, about banking regulations shaped to preserve liquidity for certain firms, about municipal franchises that would allow expansion in rapidly growing cities. Every phrase that softens a demand, assurances, consideration, cooperation, is a reminder of the stakes beneath the civility. These men rarely threatened. They did not need to. Their vocabulary was an extension of their confidence, a way of saying everything without appearing to say anything at all. Understanding this language also means understanding its impact. These were not idle correspondences or speculative conversations. They were the scaffolding of decisions that shaped national policy. When a tariff appeared to favor one region over another, it was often because discussions in rooms like this aligned powerful interests behind a particular outcome. When a politician received unexpected support or unexpected silence from key figures, it reflected understandings formed long before the public debate. Beechwood's cabinet did not produce legislation. It produced alignment. Its papers show the first movements of ideas that would travel from this narrow room to the halls of Congress, to financial institutions, to newspaper offices crafting narratives favorable to certain outcomes. The Astors themselves were often the hosts, not necessarily the authors of these negotiations, yet their home became the stage on which influence was quietly rehearsed. For a family obsessed with maintaining social primacy, this linguistic world offered a different kind of prestige, the ability to host conversations that would ripple through the country without ever bearing their name. The cabinet's contents reveal not just what the Astors permitted in their home, but what they cultivated. A place where the boundaries between private wealth and public policy dissolved into a shared language of power. From these expressions, soft, evasive, but potent, unfolded the real consequences of the Gilded Age. Industries consolidated, regulations bent, political careers strengthened or faltered, and behind the grand facade of Beechwood, behind the polite rituals of summer society, the invisible grammar of influence took shape. The next step, inevitably, is to trace how these coded discussions translated into the world outside the cabinet. Which policies shifted, which alliances hardened, which public narratives arose to conceal the private. Negotiations. The papers do not offer full answers. They offer direction, linguistic fingerprints pointing toward decisions that reshaped both the country and the Astor legacy, echoing far beyond the quiet room where the ink first dried. The papers found in the cabinet sketched only the beginnings of decisions, but the public record, newspaper archives, congressional minutes, financial reports completed the outline. Patterns began to emerge with unsettling clarity. Notes dated late July aligned with sudden shifts in committee recommendations during the following session. A memorandum about reassurances on franchise terms preceded, by mere weeks, the approval of a key municipal concession for a railway consortium that counted Astor allies among its investors. Even the brief line, "Press support to be secured by midweek," corresponded to a cluster of editorials praising a proposed tariff adjustment that, in retrospect, benefited industries tied to the Astor orbit. Nothing in these documents offered a confession, yet the sequence felt unmistakable. Private alignment in Newport, public pivot in New York or Washington. What began as quiet conversations in a windowless room at Beechwood reverberated outward into laws that shaped markets, into mergers that rearranged industries, into appointments that determined who would regulate the banks and railroads of a rapidly expanding nation. The Astors rarely appeared as protagonists in these events. They were not the men, giving speeches on the Senate floor or testifying before committees. They were the stage managers, the ones who supplied the setting, who convened the right people at the right moment, who made certain conversations possible and others unnecessary. Their influence operated through networks, campaign donations that signaled allegiance, strategic investments that steadied wavering partners, summer invitations that served as gateways to more consequential rooms. The notes in the cabinet make this role clear not through overt declarations but through implication. A list of dates paired with initials marks the attendance of men who would soon advance or withdraw support for key bills. A slip reading "Assurances delivered" coincides with a sudden reversal from a previously antagonistic banking faction. Even the vaguest notations, "alignment achieved," "opposition softened," find echoes in the public timeline as though the cabinet's shorthand had been translated into national policy. None of this was necessarily illegal. The Gilded Age thrived on the porous boundary between public responsibility and private interest. Wealthy families like the Astors prided themselves on being custodians of stability, believing that their guidance ensured orderly progress. Yet it is precisely this confidence that casts the cabinet in a darker light. For all their philanthropy, for all the art patronage and charitable endowments that burnish their reputation, they still relied on a hidden room to shape outcomes no one had elected them to decide. The contrast is sharp. In the drawing rooms of Beechwood, the Astors cultivated an image of refinement. Literary salons, musical evenings, discussions of architecture and travel. Guests praised the grace of their hospitality, the elegance of their manners. The family projected a public persona built on taste, culture, and benevolence. But walk a few steps past the library, down a corridor meant for only a select few, and that gentility gave way to a more utilitarian function: coordination, leverage, influence measured not in compliments but in outcomes. This duality was not unique to the Astors, but they embodied it with unusual finesse. Their wealth made them hosts, their alliances made them useful, their discretion made them indispensable. In the Gilded Age, power flowed not to the loudest voice, but to the quietest room, and Beechwood's cabinet was engineered to be exactly that. The cabinet's legacy, however, did not end with the decisions it shaped. It also seeped inward into the family's own mythology. The Astors valued continuity above all else, the preservation of a name, a social position, a narrative of leadership. Yet the existence of a room devoted to decisions too delicate for the public eye suggested a fissure beneath that polished surface. Maintaining a legacy required not only building grand houses and endowing institutions, but also tending the machinery of influence that kept their world aligned with their interests. For the next generation, the cabinet became both inheritance and burden. They lived surrounded by the results of its quiet negotiations. Fortunes expanded, social authority upheld, yet none could speak openly of its role. Even its physical presence was eventually repressed, sealed behind a door that no longer admitted conversation. The room that once shaped markets and guided political tides became a hollowed symbol, a silent witness to ambitions that time had chosen not to record fully. From this point, the story turns inward. The documents reveal how the cabinet shaped the world beyond Beechwood, but the next question is how it shaped the Astors themselves. What they believed they were safeguarding, what they feared might unravel, and how the need to protect both reputation and advantage forged fractures within the family's own carefully curated legacy. The cabinet's silence did not end with the generation that built it. When the Astor patriarchs receded from the stage, their heirs confronted the room less as a tool and more as a problem, an inheritance without instructions. Some knew of its existence only through oblique references in letters or through the caution of older relatives who insisted certain corridors were not for company. Others had seen the door themselves, noted its stubborn lock, and understood, without asking, that it guarded something the house no longer wished to explain. Across the early 20th century, as Beechwood underwent renovations to match new tastes, the cabinet remained conspicuously untouched. Walls were opened to expand salons, windows added to brighten rooms darkened by Victorian formality, but that narrow corridor stayed intact. Architects' notes show measurements taken around the sealed door, never through it. One heir, pressed by designers to modernize the West Wing, wrote only, "That room stays as is." No reason given, none needed. The past had carved out a pocket of untouchability, and the family learned to build around it. Behind that restraint lay disagreements. Some descendants, eager to project a streamlined, philanthropic image suited to the new century, argued that any compromising documents should be destroyed. They feared retroactive scandal, newspaper columnists hungry for stories about Gilded Age excess, reformers ready to reinterpret private influence as corruption. Others, more conservative, viewed the cabinet as part of the house's marrow, a relic of their predecessors' judgment. To them, destruction felt like disloyalty, a breach of the unspoken pact that governed powerful families. Protect the hand that built you, even when that hand can no longer defend itself. The result was a compromise of sorts, not preservation, not confession, but containment. Someone removed the most sensitive papers long before the modern opening. The gaps are too patterned to be accidental. Empty folders with torn margins, envelopes labeled only by month and stripped of contents, faint notes referring to annexes that no longer exist. All hint at a methodical excision carried out quietly, likely over several years. What remained was curated absence, a collection designed to reveal the cabinet's function without exposing its consequences. Within the family, the room became a kind of moral boundary. Younger heirs, raised in an era obsessed with transparency and reform, found its secrecy unsettling. Older relatives dismissed such discomfort as naivete, reminding them, gently or sharply, that legacies are built as much on what is forgotten as on what is remembered. The cabinet stood between these generations like a locked allegory, a warning about how influence once operated, and a reminder of the price paid to maintain a name that must never waver in public esteem. And yet the door remained shut. Even when ownership shifted, even when the estate was leased, sold, repurposed, the lock held. Perhaps no one wanted to be responsible for opening it. Perhaps each generation believed the next would inherit both the authority and the burden. Or perhaps the room had already served its purpose, and leaving it sealed became a form of quiet penance, a way to bury the compromises that had sustained the family's rise. When a family decides what must endure and what must disappear, the choice is rarely neutral. It shapes the stories the world hears and the shadows it never sees. If you found such a room, its air thick with the hesitations of those who came before, would you open it or let its silence remain intact? Only after the cabinet's rediscovery did historians begin to see how selectively the 20th century retold the Astor myth. Biographers focused on philanthropy, prestige, the rituals of high society. Architectural guides praised Beechwood's proportions without mentioning the abandoned room at its spine. The deeper machinery of influence, the sealed cabinet, the erased papers, the internal debates about what the future should be allowed to know, slipped quietly out of the narrative, replaced by a polished nostalgia that left no space for the darker geographies of power. In the decades when Beechwood thrived, the public saw only what the Astors allowed them to see. Newspapers portrayed the family less as power brokers than as arbiters of taste, patrons of art, society's North Star, the embodiment of refinement in a country still learning how to display its wealth. Headlines praised their soirees, their charitable galas, the precision with which they choreographed a social season. Columns reported the flowers at their dinners, the visiting dignitaries who bowed over gloved hands, the elegance of a culture that seemed immune to the vulgarity of politics. What never appeared in print was the machinery behind that serenity. Not a single clipping mentioned the meetings hinted at in the cabinet's notes, the discreet arrivals through Beechwood's side entrance, the conversations that shaped the bills debated weeks later in Albany or Washington. The silence was not the result of ignorance, it was a product of design. Editors were invited to the mansion not as journalists, but as guests. A flattering mention of a paper's society editor in a guest list could soften an entire newsroom. An exclusive charity preview or a well-placed advertisement bought more than visibility. It bought goodwill. The Astors understood that influence did not end with decisions. It depended on the story told afterward. Their cabinet, windowless and nearly airless, was the hidden preface to a script of public perception. After negotiations concluded, after sentiment in committee shifted or an understanding solidified, trusted intermediaries made sure the narrative moved smoothly from private alignment to public endorsement. Newspapers, eager to maintain access to the most prestigious household in Newport, framed developments in language that echoed the cabinet's own euphemisms. Unexpected consensus, broad support, clarification of terms. Outcomes appeared to flow naturally from expert judgment, never from conversations held at a desk no reporter had ever seen. Social columns reinforced the illusion. Photographs of Beechwood's terraces were paired with captions celebrating cultural leadership rather than political influence. The family's philanthropy, libraries endowed, hospitals funded, served as a luminous shield, blurring any suspicion that their hospitality also functioned as soft governance. By the U.S. turn of the century, the Astors had become a brand of respectability, their name invoked not in debates about regulation or banking charters, but in stories about fashion, literature, and the art of gracious living. Behind that polished image lay the mechanisms of protection. Newspapers dependent on advertising from Astor-backed enterprises, editors whose careers advanced through carefully tended relationships, publishers who benefited from investments tied, directly or indirectly, to families that ruled the social map of New York. It was not censorship, it was choreography, a system in which everyone understood the steps and no one voiced the music. And the cabinet, silent in its narrow corridor, was part of that choreography. It was the place where influence acquired shape before it was translated into phrases the public could digest. A decision forged under its dim light could later emerge as a narrative of prudence, civic duty, or inevitable progress. The room concealed not only the negotiations but the transition between truth and presentation, between what the public was allowed to suspect and what it was trained to admire. When the 20th century arrived, film studios and later the Golden Age of Hollywood recast the Gilded Age as a spectacle of diamonds, carriages, and grand romances. The shadows were edited out. In these retellings, the Astors became icons of elegance, their world a set piece of social aspiration. No camera panned toward a narrow corridor beside. A library. No script mentioned the vocabulary of sentiment and assurances. The narrative held, as it always had, because it was easier and more beautiful than the truth. But the silence behind that beauty lingered, waiting for the moment when the locked door at Beechwood would open, and the room that once shaped public stories would finally reveal the ones it had suppressed. By the time Hollywood entered its golden age, the world that had produced Beechwood's cabinet had already begun slipping into nostalgia. On screen, the Gilded Age became a visual shorthand for elegance. Sweeping staircases, gleaming ballrooms, men in evening coats disappearing into richly paneled studies. Directors and set designers, drawing more from cultural memory than from documented reality, created a composite world where the powerful retreated to cigar rooms and patriarchs delivered pronouncements from behind oversized desks. These spaces often lacked names, identified only by their mood. The study, the private room, the office upstairs. Yet their narrative purpose echoed the cabinets, a chamber where decisions were made out of sight, where the tone shifted from performance to strategy. Audiences accepted these rooms instinctively. By then, the idea of the elite having private sanctuaries for delicate matters had become part of the cultural grammar. Even comedies of manners featured the obligatory moment when a family elder invited a suitor to "step into my study," a phrase that carried the faint residue of older, more consequential conversations. Dramas and noirs leaned further into the trope, using shadowed interiors to signal intrigue, inheritance conflicts, or discreet negotiations. Unlike Beechwood's cabinet, these cinematic rooms were rarely windowless or sealed. They needed to be visually compelling, but they served the same narrative function, a space on the boundary between power and secrecy. Yet in translation from history to film, something essential was lost. Hollywood neutralized the unease that clung to rooms like the cabinet. It replaced their political weight with melodrama, their economic implications with family tensions, their influence over public life with personal revelations. The forbidden room became an archetype, a dramatic device rather than an instrument of real-world decision-making. Viewers learned to associate such spaces with plot twists and hidden wills, not with the shaping of tariffs, railway concessions, or banking policy. The irony is that these fictional echoes preserved, however faintly, the outline of a truth the public record had long suppressed. While films romanticized high society, depicting its secrecy as charming or tragic, the actual history of families like the Astors remained sanitized. Studio-era narratives preferred their powerful characters flawed but harmless, their secrets intimate rather than systemic. The cabinet, in such retellings, would have contained letters of unrequited love, not the scaffolding of national influence. Meanwhile, historians and archivists of the 20th century often focused on architecture, fashion, and social customs, leaving the deeper structures of Gilded Age power untouched. The cultural imagination, shaped by decades of cinema, filled the gaps with images that were aesthetically accurate but politically hollow. The result was a shared memory of an era defined by grace and excess, with little sense of the locked rooms that orchestrated its outcomes. Only recently, as digitization and renewed interest in archival work have pushed researchers deeper into long-forgotten collections, Has the opportunity arisen to revisit those shadows? The rediscovery of the cabinet at Beechwood, its door finally opened after a century, did more than illuminate a single room. It revealed how easily history can be softened, blurred, and repainted for the sake of narrative, whether in newspapers of the 1890s or films of the 1930s. And it reminded us that behind every glamorous set piece, there may lie a quieter story that was never meant to be seen again. In the present era, the cabinet no longer hides in darkness. It hides in data. Once opened, its papers, fragmented, anonymous, stripped of their original context, entered a new kind of threshold, the digital archive. What had once been a room designed to avoid documentation became, paradoxically, an object of documentation itself. Historians logged each slip of paper, each torn margin, each faint pencil mark. High-resolution scans captured the ghost impressions on the blotter, infrared imaging revealed overwritten lines, and cross-referencing software mapped the linguistic patterns that linked these fragments to other Astor collections scattered across libraries and private estates. Suddenly, the cabinet was no longer a curiosity in an old house. It was a dataset. Researchers compared its shorthand with similar notations found in correspondence from Astor offices in New York, in Banker. Archives connected to allied families, in municipal files where unexplained shifts in policy occurred close to the dates inscribed, vaguely but insistently, in the cabinet's notes. Patterns emerged not as certainties but as constellations, suggestive, repeating, never quite forming into a single definitive shape. For scholars of the Gilded Age, this reframed the room entirely. It ceased to be just a locked space and became a case study in the machinery of influence, how private wealth shaped public outcomes, how families curated their own reputations, how records were constructed and dismantled simultaneously. The cabinet offered a rare physical embodiment of something long theorized but seldom preserved: the infrastructure of discretion. It forced historians to reckon with the moral ambiguity of an era celebrated for its opulence but defined, in quieter corners, by its capacity to operate beyond accountability. Yet the digitalization process also illuminated the boundaries of what can never be recovered. Too many documents were excised before the room was sealed, leaving gaps that no technology can fill. Mentions of annexed reports lead nowhere. Notes referencing meetings provide no names. Envelopes marked by month offer no hint of year. Every clue seems to gesture toward something larger just beyond reach. Hypotheses can be built, solid, cautious, supported by parallel archives, but certainty remains elusive, as if the room still insists on retaining a portion of its original secrecy. For contemporary researchers, this raises questions that are as ethical as they are historical. How far should one infer from patterns that were designed, from the beginning, to obscure themselves? Is it responsible to map influence when the documentation deliberately withholds attribution? To what extent can we speak of Astor involvement without slipping into narratives too eager to condemn or too eager to exonerate? The room demands both rigor and restraint. It is an archive that teaches humility. Still, the rediscovery of the cabinet has changed the conversation. What was once an overlooked annotation, private cabinet, access restricted, is now central to debates about how the Gilded Age wielded its power and how families like the Astors mediated the tension between public virtue and private leverage. More importantly, it challenges the very way history is written, reminding us that the absence of evidence is often evidence of design, that silence can be an artifact as telling as ink. As the digital files circulate among scholars, each new analysis adds a layer of interpretation, a fresh angle, a refined hypothesis. No single narrative emerges, and perhaps none should. The cabinet's legacy may lie not in yielding answers, but in expanding the questions we ask about authority, secrecy, and the architecture of influence. And now, with the groundwork laid, we move toward a conclusion that cannot resolve the mystery, but can acknowledge its weight. An ending that keeps the door slightly ajar, inviting anyone willing to look closer to step into the shadows where history and omission meet. The cabinet at Beechwood began as a whisper in an 1884 inventory, a line of ink that named a room without describing it. For decades, it remained nothing more than a sealed door in a quiet corridor, its purpose softened by time, its documents thinned by deliberate hands. Only when the lock finally yielded did the ark become visible, the boxes of nameless papers, the torn seals, the coded notes about tariffs and franchises, the evidence of conversations that shaped public decisions while avoiding public sight. Nothing inside proved a single scandal. Instead, it revealed something more fundamental, the method by which influence preserved itself, discreetly, confidently, just beyond the reach of any official record. The Astors were not alone in this practice. Across the Gilded Age, elite families built their legacies not only on fortunes and foundations, but on silence, on the meticulous management of what the world was allowed to know. Their grand houses dazzled with sunlight and spectacle, yet always held a space like this, a room where decisions were made, guarded, and then buried beneath generations of careful omission. History remembers their philanthropy, their architecture, their refinement. But the gaps, the absences, speak just as loudly. They remind us that power often survives not by proclamation, but by the quiet removal of context. Today, the cabinet stands as both artifact and warning. Its papers testify to a political ecosystem in which private rooms steered public outcomes, and its emptiness, its missing reports, its excised names, reveals how expertly a legacy can be edited before it ever reaches the archive. What remains is neither condemnation nor vindication, but a sober understanding that secrecy itself was a tool of governance, shaping laws, markets, reputations, and the very memory of an era that preferred its shadows well-dressed. As we close the door once more, this time with the advantage of hindsight rather than fear, the invitation is simple. Look again. Consider what stories endure because someone wanted them told, and what histories dissolve because someone ensured they never found the page. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what the Gilded Age worked so hard to dim. And if you wish to keep examining what the elite tried to bury inside their own walls, stay with these stories. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.